Back in 2016, I was driving cross-country to visit my sister in Colorado. I had just started a new job and couldn't afford a plane ticket, so I opted for the cheaper alternative, a solo road trip. I planned my route carefully and booked hotels in advance for each night. But on the third day of my journey, I miscalculated the distance between stops. Somewhere in the middle of Kansas, I realized I wasn't going to make it to my planned hotel before midnight. It was already past PM, and the two-lane highway stretched endlessly into the night. The area was desolate, just vast, empty fields on either side, and the occasional cluster of trees. My GPS showed no major towns for miles. I was starting to panic when I saw a flickering neon sign in the distance, the Last Stop Motel. It looked run down, something out of a horror movie. The sign buzzed faintly as I pulled into the gravel parking lot. A single street lamp cast a dim, yellow glow over the cracked asphalt. There were only a handful of cars parked outside, and most of the windows in the small, L-shaped building were dark. Despite the unsettling vibe, I didn't have many options. I was too tired to keep driving, and my phone had just dipped below 10% battery. I grabbed my bag and approached the office. The door creaked loudly as I stepped inside, and a little bell rang overhead. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the carpet was worn thin in places. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his gray hair slicked back, and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked up from an old radio that was quietly playing some static-filled country tune. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah, just for the night," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He slid a dusty ledger across the counter. "Name and payment. Cash only." I hesitated. The whole setup felt off, but exhaustion won out. I handed him a few crumpled bills and scribbled my name in the book. He didn't even glance at it before handing me an old-fashioned brass key with a tarnished number 7 engraved on it. "Rooms around the back," he said, already turning his attention back to the radio. "Checkouts at 9 sharp." I nodded and made my way outside. The air felt heavier than before, thick and humid, despite the cool night. Room 7 was at the far end of the building, tucked into a shadowy corner where the lone street lamp barely reached. The door was chipped and faded, and the number on it was barely legible. When I stepped inside, the room was just as shabby as I'd expected. The wallpaper was peeling, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The bedspread was an ugly floral pattern, and the air smelled faintly of bleach mixed with something metallic. I locked the door behind me, slid the chain into place, and tossed my bag onto the bed. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not the kind of peaceful quiet you find in the countryside, but an oppressive, unnatural silence. No crickets, no wind, nothing. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned on the small TV in the corner for some background noise, but it only picked up static. Great. Deciding to brush it off, I grabbed my toiletries and headed to the bathroom. The faucet squealed as I turned it on, and the water that sputtered out was brown at first before running clear. I washed my face quickly, all too aware of how dim the single overhead bulb was. When I returned to the main room, I noticed something strange. My bag, which I'd left on the bed, was now sitting on the floor. I froze, staring at it. I was sure I hadn't moved it. Maybe it had fallen, but the bed wasn't slanted, and the bag hadn't been near the edge. I picked it up and placed it back on the bed, my heart thudding a little harder now. Just as I was about to lie down, there was a soft knock at the door. I jumped. It was so quiet outside that the knock seemed to echo unnaturally. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything, just the faint glow of the street lamp. Then, caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow shifting just out of view. My stomach churned. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. Just silence. I waited a few more seconds, my eye pressed to the peephole, but whoever or whatever was out there didn't come back into view. I double-checked the lock and chain before retreating to the bed. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself, or maybe another guest had the wrong room. I lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight, but it didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of the doorknob rattling. My eyes snapped open, and my breath caught in my throat. The chain lock vibrated slightly, as if someone was trying to force the door open. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The rattling stopped abruptly, but the silence that followed was worse. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it toward the door. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. My phone's clock read 3:13 a.m. I sat there, clutching the flashlight, for what felt like hours. Finally, as the first hint of dawn light seeped through the curtains, I worked up the courage to leave. I didn't even bother to shower or change. I threw my bag over my shoulder, unlocked the door, and bolted for my car. The office was empty when I passed by, and the neon sign was off, leaving the place even eerier in the morning light. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The motel looked smaller, almost shrunken, and for a moment, I questioned if it had ever been real. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. At a diner, I told the waitress about the strange motel. She frowned and shook her head. "There hasn't been a motel on that stretch of road in years," she said. "It burned down in the 80s. A fire killed the owner and a few guests. They say it was suspicious, but no one was ever charged." My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded numbly. That night, I looked up the motel online. Sure enough, there were articles about the fire. One of them even included a picture of the old sign, the Last Stop Motel. It was the same one I'd seen glowing in the darkness. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that I'll never take another lonely back road again. Some places are meant to stay forgotten.